Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to the ALCTS webinar, Assessment and Technical Services. This is part 4 of the 5-part series, Research and Publication Basics. I'm Lisa Lorenzo, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee. I will be your host for today's webinar. Our presenter today is Jessica Schomberg. Jessica became interested in cataloging in high school after arguing with the public library cataloger about where the science fiction should be shelved. Jessica currently serves as a media cataloger and as the Library Services Department Chair at Minnesota State University, Mankato. Jessica's educational background includes an MA in English, teaching English as a second language, from Minnesota State University, Mankato, and an MLIS from the University of Washington, Seattle. She brings much expertise to today's topic, and we are very fortunate to have her with us today. A few logistics for today's presentation. All attendees are muted to prevent background noise, and we do not have interactive chat capabilities. You may, however, comment on today's presentation using Twitter. The hashtag is ALCTSCE. We do not monitor the Twitter feed, so if you have questions for our presenter, please type them into the questions box on your screen. We will have time for Q&A after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with links to the recording and presentation slides shortly after the presentation concludes. And now here's Jessica. There will be a slight delay as we change presenters.
Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Jessica Schomberg, and thank you, Lisa, for the introduction. I am going to just sort of jump right into this presentation. At the end of the presentation, I will have some contact information. If you want to contact me directly, you are very welcome to do so. So, assessment as technical services, or assessment in technical services. I view tech services assessment as a research process where you have to think about questions that you want to answer. What do you need to know? Why do you need to know it? How you are going to use what you learn. Because the various options you have depending on what your needs are, I think of this process as kind of like a choose your own tech services assessment adventure, where depending on your answers to certain questions, you follow different paths. Because these adventures are not fully prescripted, you will all have to keep track of your own journey along the way. So if you happen to have paper and pencil along with you on the journey today, it's not a bad idea to have it accessible in case you want to make notes for yourself. To support you in that, I've also included some reflection questions within the presentation to help you think things through. In terms of the information I'm going to cover, I'm going to talk about the different types of content that sort of make up tech services assessment. This includes categories of assessment types like quality control or cost analysis, methods and tools like focus groups and products like Climate Qual, and the decision making that you need to engage with along the way. In terms of categories, that includes formal quality management processes. Those tend to require a lot of administrative power and follow through, and I'm not sure how often they're used. They're not written about a lot, but they're pretty intensive and might be really beneficial, or might be more work than you really want to do for this. And that's a decision that's going to be up to you and your institution. Some quality management processes include ISO 9001, which is a set of quality management standards, and that is really focused on process. So it's important to define your scope ahead of time. Is your scope the building, your service provision, your work area? And this is designed to help your organization meet stakeholder needs and regulatory requirements related to your services or the products you produce. At the end of the presentation, I will have a link to a bibliography that I referenced throughout. And if you're particularly interested in that, Nuria Bolagwe has a few examples of this in libraries. Balanced scorecard is another quality management process that identifies what customer needs and how to supply it. This is really helpful for with strategic planning in terms of communicating goals, aligning work assignments with organizational goals, helping prioritize what your goals actually are, and it also helps you measure and manage progress towards your goals. If you want to learn a little bit more about this, also in that bibliography, there's a reference to Kim's 2010 article in CCQ. Time and Path is another quality management tool that you can look for more information about. This looks at specific workflows to streamline the process. And one example I would recommend if you're looking for more information on this is Dragon and Sheet Spiricella 2006 article for physical book processing. And that's an example that you could look at to think about processing other types of materials. It just happens to be books that they worked on. There's also workflow tasks that we'll be talking about. Workflow tasks can include invoicing, book processing, creating original cataloging, and there's non-workflow tasks that also you need to think about, and that includes the time that you spend checking email, professional development time, meeting time. So when you're thinking about assessing certain things, like how long it takes to catalog, like how many books you can catalog in a certain day, it's also important to think about how much time during the day are you spending just on cataloging. I'll also include a reference to Climate Qual, which is an organizational climate and diversity assessment tool. And there's user surveys. One that I would specifically recommend is looking at Mugridge's 2015 survey to identify customer perceptions of tech services and service gaps. So that's just sort of a really brief overview of the variety of assessment processes, tools, methods, decision-making steps that you have along the way. And we'll spend the next almost hour talking about that in more detail. In terms of categories, that was one of the first things I mentioned on the previous slide. There are 8 categories I have observed in looking at the research that's been done in this area within tech services. They are quality control, efficiency and production, cost. Those are the most written about in my observation. Also workflows and organizational structure, workplace culture, usability, training and development, and administration. These are the category names that I've given based on my own observations. I think any one of us could probably come up with our own labels for these things that make sense to us, but we're going to work with my ideas right now. After those top 3, the rest of the categories have a lot less written about them, at least at this point. So if you're looking for research ideas for professional research, that's an area that you might want to look at. If you are looking for work that other people have done in this area, unfortunately, you're not going to find a whole lot yet on usability or workplace culture within a tech services assessment context. But for more information on these categories, we'll start at the top with quality control. There are a lot of articles written on that and a lot of different approaches to that. In particular, I like Eric Mitchell's 2013 article, also referenced in that bibliography at the end. That article, or this concept, includes formal processes like the ISO certification I mentioned earlier. Quality in this paradigm is used as a multi-layered, continuous process that's relative to the needs and expectations of your users. Quality control methods often value innovation and experimentation over rigid controls, but it's also easy to get caught up in counting things over the intangible aspects of the cataloging work that we do. So just things to keep in mind. In terms of efficiency and production, that's also another really common type of assessment that's been written about. Michelle Charbonneau and McCain and Shorten have articles on this topic that are really good and that I would highly recommend if you haven't read them already. The focus of this category is often do more faster. And a tech services realm in practice, this often leads to a breakdown of silos. The danger here again is focusing too much on counting things without paying attention to the context. Are you comparing mass market book cataloging to creating independent film records? Are you requiring staff to only do one thing like descriptive headings as a way to improve efficiency, but not providing them opportunities for more engaging work like creating authority records or doing subject analysis? So if you focus on efficiency and production, I'd also recommend like taking a step back to look at the broader picture. Cost also has had a lot written about it for reasons that I think we can all understand. In 2009, ALCTS had a task force report on tech services compiled by Aaron Stelberg and Christopher Cronin that I would recommend reading. It's about 10 years old at this point, but I don't think much has changed. Some of the things that I've noticed from looking at cost articles, in this one in particular, is that the profession lacks operational definitions of value and cost. Identifying consistent staffing and productivity cost benchmarks is difficult due to the differences between libraries. Even within libraries, I have one co-cataloger at my institution, and we do different types of cataloging. So comparing our cataloging rates in an efficiency and production way won't really tell us what the value of what we're producing is, or how much cost is important for the type of work we do. Also, many cost studies try to identify ways of increasing output without adding staff time or other resources, ignoring issues of quality and backlogs. So if you're arguing against cataloging, also one point related to this, if you're arguing against cataloging low value or ephemeral resources from a cost standpoint, are you considering that those resources are often from and about marginalized communities? So if you're focusing on cost above all else, are we really supporting our professional values to serve the needs of all users, including users from smaller communities or more marginalized communities? You'll probably notice that every time I talk about these different categories, I critique the things that aren't addressed in them. So that's going to continue. And with workflows and organizational structures, one article that I really enjoyed was Pao Yu's article about the University of Nevada Reno Libraries reorganizing their tech services unit to better respond to shifts in work expectations and user demands. And this kind of goes along with the breaking down of silos and reorganizing institutions in that broken down silo way. She made several, identified several key pieces that made that change in organizational structure successful. First, tying strategic directions the unit identified to the library's strategic priorities, noting the importance of monitoring trends and making selective implementation decisions, highlighting the importance of communicating internally within tech services and externally with stakeholders outside tech services, and notes the need to diligently invest in professional development opportunities for staff. All of these factors relate to building and maintaining a workplace that utilizes ongoing assessment for decision making. None of these factors focus on counting things to the exclusion of all else. And one of the reasons I enjoy the workflow and organizational structure articles that I have seen is that they are thinking about the process from a higher level, from beginning to end. Workplace culture is another category of assessment that I've seen a little bit on, but not as much as I would like to at this point. And some questions that I have had in response to those, what I've seen is, Do tech services and non-tech services staff have the same perceptions about organizational priorities, about tech services priorities, about what's important for users? So if we're thinking about authority control within a cataloging context, as a cataloger, I recognize the importance of authority control, but how would I assess the value that others in my organization have related to authority control issues, and how would I tell a story using that information to explain its importance? Those are just some things that I can think about and respond to this category. Other questions are tech services librarians attending non-tech services meetings. How do we assess the overall workplace culture if we're all broken down into silos where people don't talk? And more questions, are staff able to raise any concerns they have about, for example, in a cataloging context again, because that's my background, are staff able to raise concerns they have about bias subject headings or descriptive practices or anything else that happens in a tech services context? That's all dependent on a workplace culture, and that's an important part of the overall picture of tech services work. Usability is the next category that we're going to talk about. I feel like I'm seeing a little bit more work done in this area from the user side, still not much from the tech services worker side, but we'll take what we can get. One article that I would recommend for this category is Philip Heider and Ka-Ching Tan's article on quality measures in CAD assessment, focusing on completeness of records and on error rates. And they also note that much less attention has been paid to user search goals, user strategies, and how users interpret catalog information. So they wanted to find more information about what users actually want to see in records. And that's a thing that catalogers don't talk about as much as I would like to see, so I was glad to see that work. Another question, because I'm filled with questions, when you're talking about usability in your workplaces and in your meetings, are you thinking of ways to solicit patron input and feedback from non-tech services staff? Training and development is the next category we'll be talking about. Most of the research I've seen in this area has been from Jungren Park and Yuji Tasaka. And some of the questions that they have brought up include, are you evaluating the types of training and educational opportunities available to tech services staff? Are you evaluating what kind of training tech services staff need and want? Are you evaluating the existence, accuracy, or readability of existing documentation? I'll say at my institution, most of my assessment brain has been focused on creating better documentation to document the specific steps we need to do as we migrate to ALMA, but also what new workflows we need to put in place, how we can make sure that we are engaging in conversation across the library that incorporates user needs as identified by public services librarians, the quality issues that they have concerns about. Each one of these pieces you might notice touches a lot of the others, and I think that's fine. These categories are, as I said, my labeling of the different areas that I've seen, but I do think there's a lot of overlap, and with training and development, I would think that there would especially be a lot of overlap. And the last category I'll be talking about is administration, which is a more higher level, taking a step back approach. I would recommend basically starting with anything Rebecca Mugridge has written. Her writing is often aimed at administrators and focused on how assessment ties in with area priorities, work assignments, workflows, usabilities, and bringing all of the aforementioned categories together. So that is that. So I've talked a lot, so we are going to go to the next slide, which is a reflection question. I am going to give everyone about a minute to think through these questions, either individually or with groups. and then we will move on. And in case the slides are not showing for everyone, I just thought about that. What assessment categories are you most interested in researching? What assessment categories do you have the most experience with? And now we will move to talking about methods and tools. So this is a research series from ALCTS, and as part of that, identifying research methods, I think, is an important way to consider how you approach assessment of tech services. There are there's a world of research methods available to you for however you would like to do your assessment work. I will say, as someone who came out of library school before research methods was required, I really wish I could go back in time and take a research methods class in library school, but it's not possible. So I've had to learn a lot of research methods on my own through various ways. So knowing that I'm not the only one who needs a little learning time for research methods, I broke these out into different categories with some references to places you can go to start learning about them if there's a particular area of interest to you. So research methods, generally speaking, can be broken out into quantitative or numerical methods and also qualitative or narrative methods. They can be used together or separately depending on your needs, your expertise, and what resources you have available. Quantitative methods include cost accounting, which is analyzing and assigning costs to specific processes and then trying to control those costs. Performance indicators, which numerically demonstrate how effective you are at meeting your objectives. This could include spot checks aimed at finding, for example, 90% of your descriptive data is accurate, or 80% of your records are full level, or 75% of books are arrived and processed the same day. They're clearly measurable and often set with a goal of making and evaluating improvements. Log data would be another type of quantitative measurement, looking at how your users are doing searches, like how many of them are doing author searches, title searches, other types of searches, and just sort of monitoring that. There's some data privacy issues to consider along with that, but don't really have time to go into that today. Surveys are popular within library research. They're useful to ask a large group of people about cataloging assessment practices, like what they do, how users or non-tech services staff rate the importance of cataloging services, all sorts of different things. If you're planning to do a survey and you have access to someone with a social statistics background, I would highly recommend taking advantage of that because it will help you do research that is better quality. And even if you're not planning on publishing it, it will just help your data be more useful for you. Qualitative assessments, that could include ethnographies. For anyone not familiar with what an ethnography it is observing and participating in groups to understand how the group operates, self-identifies, responds to change. So you could participate in a cataloging group to see sort of those things. One of the benefits of an ethnography is that it can result in inclusively developed practical ideas for process improvements. If you're interested in this idea, I would recommend seeing Daniel Nyland's organizational ethnography for more information. Observations are seeing how users navigate the metadata in cataloging records or how staff catalog resources. If you're interested in usability, this is a really common usability practice. In-depth interviews, These are often combined with theoretical models during analysis. And I know a lot of catalogers and tech services people think that we don't operate within a theoretical model, but that we do. Ring and Athens, 5 laws is a theoretical model. Cutter's notion of a universal language for subject headings is a theoretical model. So if we're making use of these practices in our cataloging, we can also do interviews about how those models impact what we're doing. Interviews can be of individuals or groups. Questions are often conceptual but loosely structured to allow interviewees to present their experiences in their own ways. And it's a good way to understand process a little bit better. Focus groups include groups of participants and a researcher who moderates discussion. It may include participants responding to specific questions or the group discussing general topics. This is sometimes done before quantitative analysis to, for example, identify what questions to ask during a survey. It's also sometimes done in conjunction with interviews or observations. And case study is the final method that I'll be talking about today. And that an example of that is the Paushan Yu article I mentioned earlier, looking at the University of Nevada, Reno's Tech Services Unit, or Amelia Coford's study of how disability studies scholars interact with subject headings. If you're curious to see more about different research methods, the Encyclopedia of Research Design has a lot more information, or really the Google, the Google has a lot too. And we are going to move on to tools now. So as I mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation, formal quality management processes tend to require a lot of administrative power and follow through. Oh, somehow my slide for this was copied onto my other slide, so I am not going to repeat all of this information. Interesting. So quality management tools include ISO 9001 quality certification and balanced scorecard, which I mentioned at the very beginning. Production methods include time and path, and identifying and distinguishing between workflow and non-workflow tasks. Workplace culture assessments include climate qual. Climate qual is going to be a thing that works better in very large institutions. My institution is too small to use that without providing information that's too identifying of people. But you can also think about other workplace culture questions that are relevant to your institution to get at what your institution needs. That can be done on a smaller basis. Customer satisfaction surveys. One that I would recommend looking up is the Tech Services and Library System Customer Service Assessment Survey. And this is a really great example that I believe you can reuse. Once again, Rebecca Mugridge is the person that I would recommend talking to about this, because she helped to develop it. And it is a great thing to take a look at. So we are going to move on to more reflection questions. So again, I'm going to give a few minutes for people to work in alone or in groups to sort of think through these questions. I presented a lot of information in a short period of time, so this also might help you to digest a little bit of what I just shared. But what assessment tools or methods would you use to respond to different scenarios? And you are welcome to come up with your own scenario if that's more meaningful to you. But some that I've come up with for practical practice purposes, if you want to check error rates in a shared cataloging environment, if you want to prioritize staff training needs, if you want to do user experience studies related to a certain area of cataloging, that could be descriptive cataloging, subject analysis, classification. It could also be related to the interface that you have at your institution. One that I think is a really hard one is if you need to justify hiring a new cataloger, what assessment methods could you use to accomplish that goal? And I'm going to give everyone probably two minutes to think through these and write down notes for yourself. All right, I'm going to interrupt your reflections a little bit. Because I have talked with people in the past, I know what questions are often at the forefront of people's minds. So I'm just going to walk you through my how I would address some of these scenarios in case it's helpful for for any of you. So if I wanted to prioritize staff training needs, the first step I would follow is to look at my organizational priorities. So if I work at a university, we have university priorities, strategic plans, 8,000 different sets of things. So I would look at what the institutional priorities are so I can justify how providing staff training supports university goals. Then I would also do sort of an informal assessment of the people I work with, which might include doing in-depth interviews with each individual to identify what their particular goals are, what their particular needs are, and compare them. And I could individually or as a group prioritize them through following an interview process or a case or a focus group process. I could also do a survey if I have a lot of staff or if I was concerned that people would not be forthcoming in one-on-one interviews. And those would just be in the talk to identify what my institution values, identify what my staff need, and then also the third step I would take would be to look at what I am expecting to come in the future. This could be, at my institution, we just migrated to ALMA. So for us, I know that staff might need a variety of training on a variety of products, but ALMA is at the forefront of everyone's minds. That would have institutional support, that would have staff support, and I can also recognize the need that because that's really direct and coming at me. So that if I wanted to prioritize something else, I would probably find different methods to use. But I do think that following a research method from start to finish is going to have a little bit less of my personal preferences and a little bit more of a higher level thinking related to what is actually needed. If I wanted to justify hiring a new cataloger, it's a hard one. I recognize that it's a hard one. Sometimes it really, really is needed. And from working in a specific area, you as a cataloging manager or you in a cataloging unit, or even you in a related tech services unit might see, okay, we really need to hire a new cataloger. How do we justify that? Again, I would look at university goals to see what the university identifies as being a need and comparing and trying to find a gap between what the university is needing and what we are able to provide. That might also involve doing a cost analysis of how much it costs to hire a new cataloger versus to outsource one. I know that it's often thought of as cost savings to outsource work, but that's not always the case. And you can find some research to identify when it's not actually a cost saving to outsource and when it's actually more a cost saving to hire someone locally. There's also quality control issues. If you have someone who is, if there's a strong local push to do work with locally created research and resources, and that's a big part of your institution, you might look at quality control and usability as areas to investigate how to find arguments for saying we need a new cataloger to provide this locally important metadata. We can't outsource for this. We can't just take it from OCLC because it's going to be it's a local need that we can't get any other way. But also can help with looking at training and development needs. So I hope that helps a little bit. That those are just the thoughts that I have initially to think through how I would, what tools and methods I would look at for that. In terms of decision making, the assessment process that I presented is really based on following a logical process based on explicit goals and objectives, using data that you have available or doing research to find the data that you need. A lot of this is based on knowing what your objectives are, identifying the appropriate tools and methods, and you might have to do research to learn how to use those tools and methods unless you have access to researchers already in your area. It's also helpful to clarify how your assessment choices will tell you whether you achieved your desired objectives. And one thing to note that I think a lot of people miss is that if your objectives change, your evaluation methods should change. I do not know what the initial objectives were for IPEDS. If you're not familiar with IPEDS, it's a national gathering of educational statistics in higher education that is going on right now and is the bane of many people who work in higher ed right now. We are required to provide a lot of statistics about how many types of things we have in our collection, how much they cost, and all that sort of thing. And I don't know what the initial objectives were for iPads, but whatever they were, they do not always seem appropriate for any of the purposes that I have as a person working in a library, even though they're supposed to reflect libraries. So you can see at a national level that identifying appropriate tools and methods is important and causes less frustration than just keeping the same things you've had, but also if you have specific objectives that are not matched by a certain tool, it's just really frustrating for everyone involved. So it does take more time to think these things through than to just jump in with the survey, but it's also really important and less frustrating for you and for the people that you have to work with. So I have a final set of reflection questions. And everyone who is participating in this webinar is hear from different institutions, so all of your answers are going to be a little different. You'll all have your own different adventures with this. But does your organization have stated objectives that you can use for assessment? That could be your university, it could be your city, it could be your school that you're with, it could be the library specifically. Do they have stated objectives or goals or priorities? They can be talked about in different terms. Do you or does your institution make decisions about what to assess based on those objectives? Or is your assessment not related to your objectives at all? Do you use assessment data to target improvements in the area that you're assessing? So, for example, if you are targeting your assessment on improving workflows and then using that information to make hiring decisions, does that actually make sense? Does that, sometimes I've seen some things where people are doing assessment about cost objectives, and then it's to improve a workflow, and then they use it to decide to fire people. And that's not going to build trust in your organization. Surprise. So if you are using assessment data for a specific purpose, really try to be clear about that purpose. But if you're, and the last question is assessment data cherry picked to justify unrelated decisions? And that can happen in a variety of intentional or unintentional ways. I'm going to give everyone probably about 2 minutes to think these things through, and then we'll come back. All right, I will now interrupt any discussions or writing that people are engaging in. So as I think about these questions in my own institution, does your organization have stated objectives? In my case, the answer is yes. We have a lot of them because I live in a highly bureaucratic organization. There are stated objectives for our state. There are stated objectives for my university. There are stated objectives for my library. And there are stated objectives for my tech services unit. And one of the stated objectives that we have is to improve our documentation. So my answer to this is yes, a lot of them, a lot of options here. but I'm going to use the goal of improving our documentation to work through the rest of the points here. Do you make decisions about what to assess based on those stated objectives? For the documentation assessment, I'm not using a formal assessment process for this. Right now, I am working in consultation with my colleagues to identify what we know how to do and what we don't know how to do, and when we need to write stuff down to make sure everyone knows how to do it. In this case, it is, as I mentioned, it's an informal assessment process that is kind of a mixture of ethnography and observation, observing when where the tricky points are, where people are really struggling to know how to do their work, where people are really struggling to find the answers to questions they have about how to do their work, and where the bottlenecks are in terms of the work getting done. So those are, in terms of the categories that I mentioned at the beginning, that's a mixture of training needs and workflow structures, and also workplace culture in terms of communication. Again, this is informal, but as an informal ethnographic analysis of what's going on in my workplace, I'm watching how the group is responding to change, how our self-identity is changing, and watching and trying to help guide developing practical solutions for making process improvements as we go along, and getting those process improvements documented and shared in a place where the information is available to people in a way that they can use. And going back to the categories again, also using usability protocols, such as working with people and observing how they use the documentation to see where in the documentation we need to make some improvements. So do we use assessment data to target improvements in the areas we're assessing? Once again, it's an informal assessment, but yes, on an ongoing basis, we are using observation, we're using ethnographic information, we're using workplace discussions to identify what needs to be improved in the documentation to make it more usable. Is assessment data cherry-picked to justify unrelated decisions? In this case, no, we're just documenting what we need to happen in a collaborative way. At this point, no unrelated decisions have been made based on this information, and I can't see anybody having the attention to do so. One of the benefits, too, of engaging in this informal documentation assessment and improvement process is that we can share with our administrators for their assessment needs that we are working towards university goals of improving access to library services for students to help support their research needs as a result of our work getting done in a effective way, and also university goals about workplace culture and inclusive decision making in the development and dissemination of our documentation. So as I think of those reflection questions in relation to what we are doing here, it's not something that is a formal big project. It's not something other than right now I ever plan to present on in a official way. It's just an informal way of improving our services to meet stated goals. And that is all that I have to share today. We are almost at the question and answer time. If you want to contact me after this one-on-one, you are very welcome to do so. My email information is provided. I'm also on Twitter constantly, so you're welcome to contact me there at any point. I also have a lot of people to thank for helping me think through how to approach assessment and how to talk about assessment, and they're listed. And at the end, there is a bibliography of assessment readings that includes, I think, everything that I've talked about today in the categories that were identified. And if you find something else that you think should be added, again, feel free to contact me, and it's a living bibliography, so updates will continue. And now it's time for questions.
Okay. Thank you, Jessica. This has been really informative, and I think you've given all of us a lot to think about. So just to reiterate for our attendees, we do now have time for questions, so please go ahead and type your questions into the question box. And then we haven't gotten any yet, so in the meantime, while we're waiting for those to come in, I'll just ask a quick one.
Sure.
Do you have any sort of method for deciding whether your assessment is going to be just an informal, internal initiative versus something that you're planning to publish?
I would, again, it's a choose your own adventure thing. For me, it depends on how much time I have. Do I have the time to go through a large-scale formal assessment process? Do I have time to go through whatever IRB approval might be needed that as a result of sharing that information? If the answer is yes, as it was a few years ago, then it's something that I plan out for, I think for that one, I planned it out about 6 months to a year before I started on it. And then it took another probably 2 to 3 years to wrap it up. And it was a great experience. I learned a lot from the process. I think it's been beneficial to my organization that I engaged in that process. But it took a lot of time, and it took a lot of energy devoted to learning new methods and new tools. For the informal assessment I'm doing right now, as I mentioned many times, we're going through a migration to ALMA right now. I don't have the energy to do a bigger scale assessment, so it's just we need to have these things happen. It needs to go well, and I need to work with my colleagues in an effective way to have the results that I want. So does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay. I'm just pausing to see if anyone... Oh, here we go. Have you come across any usability studies / assessment that were directly related to staff users as opposed to patron end users?
Yes. Can I remember off the top of my head? Not so much. But yes, the answer to that is yes. I haven't seen very much. When you're talking about staff, I think mostly what I've seen has been non-tech services staff and their needs. It's been a lot less of tech services staff. If the person who asked that question wants to email me, I can follow up and actually find the things that I've seen.
Okay.
Sorry, I just don't have that in my head.
Oh, that's okay. Pausing again for more questions to come in. I'll ask one more just to delay in case anyone else is still typing anything in. But do you have any tips maybe for handling sort of administrators or higher ups who may be reluctant to implement changes even after assessment has shown that those changes might be necessary?
I will give you my advice. Every institution is a little different. What I have done in the past is to try to identify what their priorities are. Like talking to Administrator X. Administrator X really values collegiality. I'm trying to work on justifying making a change in the work environment I'm in. So I will present it as we've identified that the current situation doesn't promote collegiality. So if we make this change, we have evidence showing that it should improve collegiality, and promising to follow up afterwards to let them know that, yes, you made the right decision in supporting our collegiality efforts, and we have made improvements. So it's the process that I follow is very much this is what the administrator values. This is what the administrator responds to. I'm presenting what my needs are in a way that the administrator is likely to hear, praising the administrator for acknowledging that need, and then following up with the administrator later to let them know that their decision in response to my request has made an improvement.
Okay, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we had a couple more that just came in. What are your strategies for illuminating the invisible, and invisible is in quotes, labor of technical services?
That's a hard one. Some ideas, and again, feel free to contact me afterwards if you want to follow up on this, but some ideas would be in terms of looking at non-workflow tasks, which sometimes that's what the invisible labor is, that non-workflow task. Sometimes if you're talking to someone who really values counting things, okay, let's count the non-workflow tasks and how much time we're spending on them. Maybe the invisible labor is about creating authority records, which we know are really important, but administrators don't. So then you could do a usability study on comparing how patrons are able to find stuff with usability or with authority information provided versus not with authority information provided, or using an authority control authority control interface versus like iTunes. It really is situation dependent, I think, in terms of what you want to prioritize. But I do think that there are a lot of potential tools that we could use to do that.
Okay.
And that's the short answer.
For sure, thanks. All right, we have one more question that we have time for. So it says, in the ALMA environment, ALMA has analytics and assessment tools to help analyze the data collected from cataloging departments. And then the cataloger has his or her working objectives / goals. They can collect from the ALMA cataloging module and ALMA analytics, if I am not wrong. So I think that's just kind of a clarification question about ALMA's capabilities.
I am still new to ALMA. We just we just transitioned this semester to ALMA, and I have not yet had time to really fully engage with the analytics. I have heard that there are a lot of capabilities within there, but I'm sorry. If you ask me the question in 6 months, maybe I'll have a better answer, but I'm still learning myself right now.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. There's one more question that we aren't going to have time to get to, unfortunately, but thank you, Jessica, for offering to answer those remaining questions offline. So we'll have those sent out via email afterwards.
Okay.
So thank you.
All right,
okay.
Thank you.
So we are glad you could all be with us today. You will soon receive a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to respond to those questions. Your comments are very, very valuable and help the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee plan future events. The email will also include links to today's slides and recording, and you now have the opportunity to receive a certificate of attendance as well. That information will also be in the email. So thank you again to our presenter, Jessica Schomberg, and thanks also to members of the Continuing Education Committee, Iping Chen-Gaffey and Felicity Dykes, and to Alana Warren from the ALCTS office. The support they provide make it possible for us to present these webinars. ALCTS has other continuing education events coming up. Please see the ALCTS website to register or find more information on this and other upcoming webinars. And ALCTS also offers web courses, which are 4 to 6 weeks long, as well as 2-day email discussions. Our next e-forum will be on April 16th, discussing assessing collections for diversity and inclusion. Please check the website for information on upcoming courses and discussions. Thank you all for joining us today, and this concludes our session.